We are halfway through 2022, and it's time to talk about the very worst comic books of the year so far. And I'm going to be honest, I could have made an entire list made up of DC Comics, and in my head, it would have been justified. I think the worst stuff that DC Comics is creating is like the worst. It's the drizzling shits in comic books. It's absolutely, putrid. It's almost unreadable, all of it. But I decided to be fair because Marvel Comics is putting out some very bad comic books as well. So we got some Marvel in here, but you're going to get a lot of heavy DC comics because I think they are absolutely shitting the bed when it comes to their terrible comic books. There are some honorable mentions I wasn't able to fit in here. Joy Operations from Brian Michael Bendis, absolutely terrible, but probably not important enough for a list like this. We also had Rockstar and Softboy by Sina Grace, which I think might have been autobiographical. Very terrible comic book. Shadows of the Bat. Mariko Tamaki's 12-issue weekly Detective Comics event. Oh my goodness. But there were at least like 2 issues in there that weren't terrible. So that kind of saved it, kept it off the list. And then finally, I would say Giant-Sized Thunderbird was really bad. Steve Orlando, Nyla Rose on that one. Really terrible comic book. But there was another comic from Marvel that was kind of in the same genre that I thought was even worse. So I decided to keep that one off. But those are all just absolutely terrible. They could have made the top 10 very easily. And I definitely want to hear from you guys. What do you think the worst comic books that you've read of 2022 are so far? Definitely let me know in the comments section. Where did I make a mistake? What did I leave off? Hell, put it down now and let's see if we have a similar list because I'm going to talk about the 10 worst comic books. Number 10, I'm going to cheat a little bit here and there. I'm going with Harley Quinn. Her series from Stephanie Phillips and Riley Rossmo was absolutely atrocious. This is the worst creative pairing in all of comic books. The worst writer with the worst artist to make the writer even worse. I don't know what the purpose of this series is. I personally don't like Harley Quinn all that much right now. I think the character is in a terrible state and is in much worse states after the treatment that the character has received, not only from Stephanie Phillips, but also let's not forget T. Franklin. Her Harley Quinn animated series, Eat, Bang, Kill Tour digital series, but also came out on physical, also had 2 issues released in 2022, and they were equally as bad, if not worse, than what the regular Harley Quinn series is. If you want to know about Peg Leg Beyonce, definitely go check out Harley Quinn, Eat, Bang, Kill Tour number 6. Absolutely atrocious stuff from T. Franklin. A lot of self-insert characters in that story from T. Franklin's perspective. That's one of her real pitfalls as a writer, and you're definitely going to hear about more self-inserts later on in the list, but Harley Quinn is in a terrible state right now. It's supposed to be a popular character, it's supposed to be a money-making character, and DC Comics have absolutely trashed the character in 2022. Let's move on to number 9. We've got the Marauders. Steve Orlando, Marvel Comics big free agent signing in 2021 comes over, takes the reins of Marauders from Jerry Duggan, and somehow made a very bad X-Men comic even worse. And I had a hard time. I wanted to fit an X-Men comic on here. I decided Marauders is worse than Knights of X. I've decided it's worse than Legion of X. I decided it's worse than New Mutants. That's how bad I think Marauders is. This title is completely pointless. And the worst part is Steve Orlando is destroying, and I do mean destroying, an absolute great character like Bishop. And he's destroying Kitty Pryde, who hasn't been really great in a long time, but Kitty Pryde used to be cool at one point. But the worst thing about Marauders, and it's not even close, is the self-insert character from Steve Orlando, Somnus, his original created character for Marvel Pride, Voices Pride 2021, whatever it was. Somnus, the character that put a man under and essentially coerced him into dreaming about them making love for 1,000 years straight. You can't make this stuff up unless you're Steve Orlando, and then you put it in the goddamn comic book Marauders. Absolutely atrocious stuff. We're sticking with Marvel here. Number 8, Phoenix Song Echo. They actually did an entire event. Jason Aaron's big Phoenix tournament that he did with Avengers, which is supposed to be a primetime A-list title. And he does this big stupid tournament that no one asked for, and he's just throwing crap at the wall. And we get Echo. Somehow was the tournament winner in a tournament of very, very capable fighters with the Marvel Comics universe. And out of that, we get Phoenix Song Echo. Marvel Comics and DC have a real problem where they start casting their creators based on the race or nationality or some of the surface traits or maybe the gender identity or the sexual preferences of the characters. And it almost always blows up in their faces. Right here, we got Rebecca Roadhorse coming in on Phoenix Song Echo and absolutely crapping the bed. Talk about being not ready for prime time. This is an absolute atrocious series. Marvel Comics should be embarrassed that they're putting out comic books that are this bad. But DC has it even worse because we go to number 7. This could have been number 1. That's how bad the rest of this list is. Number 7, DC Comics, Green Lantern, Jeff Thorne. Coming off what I thought was a very bad run by Grant Morrison, who's either great or he's terrible. And somehow, Jeff Thorne took a terrible run and made it even worse. I don't know what he was thinking, putting all the popular Green Lanterns to the side and basically starring a book with Jon Stewart, who is a great character, but then Joe Mullins and Teen Lantern. This thing was absolutely atrocious from beginning to end. Tom Rainey's art absolutely did not help. He essentially illustrates half the issues with Marco Santucci illustrating the rest of the half, that part that actually looks good. And this thing is just trash. And by the end of it, Jeff Thorne does the unforgivable. He destroys the entire Green Lantern mythos. He destroys the Central Power Battery. He kills all the Guardians of Oa. Jon Stewart isn't a Green Lantern anymore. He's some type of god, although he died in Dark Crisis. Simon Baz isn't a Lantern anymore. He's something else. And all of a sudden, because the Central Power Battery is gone and they've got this giant orb that looks like a marble, characters that have been Green Lanterns for decades upon decades just start becoming other Lanterns, like Blue Lanterns, Star Sapphires, Red Lanterns, and all this other crap. It was absolutely atrocious. It was one of the worst ideas. The execution on this thing was so poor, it could have been number 1, but I think there are worse things out there from Marvel and DC Comics. Specifically, Spider-Punk comes in at number 6. This is a great example that just because the character works as a special variant cover for Spider Variant Monthly or something out of the Spider-Verse probably doesn't warrant its own miniseries. Cody Ziegler was one of the writers on the Beyond board for Amazing Spider-Man, and his issues, quite frankly, weren't that bad. But once you read Spider-Punk, you realize he probably didn't write much of that. He was probably more like his name was on there and somebody else did all the work for him, because Spider-Punk is absolutely atrocious. It has all the worst tropes of the worst writers in modern comic books all thrown into one comic book on a character. Not that maybe he's not important, but he's supposed to be a Spider-Man. And he is the first gay Spider-Man that we know of. This thing is absolutely trash. Guess what Cody Ziegler does not know anything about? Punk. Spider-Punk. You would think maybe he liked punk music or punk culture or something like that. He put punk on the jacket of Spider-Punk and thought that was enough and just made this absolutely atrocious. The worst example of millennials creating crap that you'll ever see. Spider-Punk is so bad, but it couldn't even break the top 5. As bad as that is, there's worse stuff out there. Coming in at number 5, Marvel Voices Pride 2022 number 1. This comic book essentially lampoons and makes fun of all the people that they're supposed to be celebrating in this thing. There are so many bad stories. You would think in an anthology comic put out by Marvel Comics in 2022, one of the stories would be kind of readable. I guess Hulkling and Wiccan wasn't as bad as the others, but it still wasn't good. Everything about this thing is an absolute train wreck. All they do is like make fun of trans people and gay people. I felt so bad. I was like, man, if you came into this Marvel Voices Pride, you're like, man, this is really going to celebrate gay culture or LGBT culture or trans people. Oh no, you are in for a rude awakening. You're basically mocked the entire time, which wouldn't be bad if it was like Mad Magazine Pride 2022, but this is supposed to be a celebration. The D-Team story was absolutely atrocious. The powers that the trans heroes had in there were just so mean-spirited. They were so on the nose and just making fun of trans people. Escapade, the new trans mutant, was no better. The character's mutant power is essentially that they can trans into anyone else's like life. I was like, oh my goodness, these are some of the worst ideas. But that's what happens when you go out there and just hire the worst creators possible within the comic book writing community because they're LGBTQ+. I'm not saying don't go out there and hire them. Go out there and hire the best writers you can get. And maybe it won't be this bad. This is the final Marvel comic that we're going to have on the top 10 list. At number 4, What If Miles Morales? How about this? What if Miles Morales was a good character that had his own identity? He's already saddled with the Spider-Man identity, which everyone knows is Peter Parker. So Miles Morales in comic books has an uphill climb as it is. And then you get this atrocious What If series. And you can't really blame it on the writers because essentially he has a writer on every single issue as he takes the persona of other heroes, whether it be Wolverine, Captain America. Obviously, the most notorious one is Thor. The What If Thor issue. I mean, the writer had to come out and apologize. He had to give his money away that Marvel Comics paid him because the book was so offensive and so bad. And that's happening a lot within Marvel Comics and DC, but What If Miles Morales #4 is just, it's a special kind of terrible. There's so many really negative stereotypes in there. There's no creativity. That's what I personally find the most offensive. If you hired me to do a What If Miles Morales Thor book, first thing I would say is, why do we need this? Shouldn't we be establishing Miles Morales as this Spider-Man identity and maybe get him out from the shadow of Peter Parker? But okay, you paid me good money. I guarantee you, I would do something creative with the idea and try to elevate and spotlight some of the things that make Miles Morales cool in the Marvel Comics universe. This is none of that. This was the laziest, least creative comic book you could ever imagine. The top 3 are all DC Comics. And as I said earlier, I truly believe the entire top 10 worst comics of 2022 so far could have been DC Comics. I could have justified it, and I could have done it very easily. I'm a huge DC fan, and they are putting out so much dreck, it's not even funny. And I'm going to have to cheat on a couple of these because there's so much bad stuff out of there. This could have been the top 6 list if I'd separated this by the actual series. Number 3, we're going to talk about Aquaman. After Future State, DC Comics retained Brandon Thomas, who wrote the Aquaman series there, and also brought in Chuck Brown, and they did this Aquaman the Becoming, where Jackson Hyde, Aqualad, is ascending to the Aquaman mantle, and Arthur Curry is essentially basically giving away. It's like, you need to be Aquaman. I want to give this to you so I can go be a stay-at-home dad. And at the same time, they had this Black Manta miniseries from Chuck Brown, and then the two came together for Aquaman. By the second issue, this thing was already out of the top 100. The sales on this are absolutely atrocious. Everyone hated this story from the very beginning, from Aquaman the Becoming. How they ever got to Aquaman, where essentially you have this really bitch-made version of Jackson Hyde that is so unlikable. Why Arthur Curry would ever want this character to take his mantle and his legacy further into DC Comics, knowing what a piece of shit this character is. He's violent, he's dangerous, and he has almost zero heroics about him. Aquaman should be important. That character made $1 billion. I believe out of all the DC Comics properties that have been made into films, it made the most revenue. That's a lot of money. This character is supposed to be important. Why are you handing the mantle off to a new character in Jackson Hyde? But even if you wanted to do that, why aren't you doing it well? Why are you making this character so unlikable? They need to bring somebody in and get Aquaman straight, because this character isn't going to sell for another decade. They have done so much damage with Brandon Thomas and Chuck Brown making Aquaman comics in 2021 and 2022. It's absolutely atrocious. But what is worse, in my opinion, is Tim Sheridan. Probably the worst new writer DC Comics has hired, maybe in the history. I think he's worse than Stephanie Phillips. And I think Stephanie Phillips is bad. I think he makes Vita Ayala read like Alan Moore. That's how bad I think Tim Sheridan is. Teen Titans Academy is number 2 quite easily. This is one of the worst written ongoing comics I've ever read in my lifetime. I don't mind them taking the original Teen Titans and putting them in a school environment where they're the professors. I don't mind them taking a back seat so we can elevate some of these new characters. But Tim Sheridan came in with an agenda, and his agenda was creating new LGBTQ characters. He wasn't interested in writing a good story, and he wanted to use Red X as his hook. That's how he was going to get people to come in and read his stupid Teen Titans Academy series. And some people were excited about that, obviously coming out of the animated universe. The reveal on Red X was actually worse than everything he did before that, and everything he did before that was fucking trash. It's amazing how somehow you can get an idea of, like, I know who Tim Sheridan is. He's a really bad comic book writer. Nothing he does is going to be good, and somehow he still brings down the bar. I expect nothing out of this writer, and he still subverts those expectations and delivers something worse than I could have possibly imagined. Tim Sheridan, who's very lucky to be on Flashpoint Beyond because Jeff Johns can actually write a comic book, is just absolutely so untalented. Go back and read his stuff in Future State. Go back and read Teen Titans Academy. I believe he also did a Shazam miniseries. He hasn't written one good comic book on his own. And you know DC Comics are going to keep bringing him back because they are looking to save pennies. They are penny pinchers right now. And it doesn't matter if they're hiring the worst writers in DC Comics history, which I firmly believe Tim Sheridan probably is that. How could you beat Tim Sheridan's Teen Titans Academy and actually be worse? By putting out so much terrible content centered around one character that you take the crown. Coming in at number 1 is just Wonder Woman. Everything around Wonder Woman right now is awful. Leading into Trial of the Amazons, the first Wonder Woman event in decades, we had this Wonder Woman series by Clunrad, Becky Cloonan and Michael Conrad. They are absolutely trash. They didn't put good artists, and the stories were terrible. But we also got Nubia and the Amazons from Vita Ayala and Stephanie Williams. It was equally trash, if not somehow worse. So you have these perfect storms leading up into Trial of the Amazons. You also have Wonder Girl, which was canceled very early, despite Yara Flor being somewhat popular. And we get into Trial of the Amazons, where we have Clunrad, Becky Cloonan, Michael Conrad, Stephanie Williams, Vita Ayala, Joelle Jones writing this thing. How could it fail? Is just characters talking to each other for 24 pages at a time, with maybe a sliver of action thrown in here and there so they can call it a superhero comic book. It was so terrible. I felt so bad for Wonder Woman fans. You never get a big event. You never get something really dedicated to Wonder Woman and Amazon lore and all that stuff. And these writers in here with no talent are just destroying everything. And coming out of it, what do we get? More bad Wonder Woman comics from Becky Cloonan and Michael Conrad. We get Nubia Coronation Special, just as bad as you would expect. And we get Nubia Queen of the Amazons, which is just as bad as you would expect. Nobody is buying any of these comic books. Everybody is avoiding Wonder Woman like the plague. The character is so cool, so important to DC Comics. The fact that they let it get this bad is just, it's beyond comprehension that DC Comics could drop the ball on a character like Wonder Woman quite like this. And because of the sheer volume of terrible comic books, it supersedes one of the worst writers DC Comics has ever hired in Tim Sheridan. Because you put 5 terrible writers on one big event with the characters and multiple titles, and it did just all of them to suck. There hasn't been a good page of comic book that has come out of any of it. And if you need more information on why Tim Sheridan is so terrible and some of the agendas that he came into the series with, I did do this video kind of talking about some interviews that he had, where this thing just fell apart and why it is so bad. It's beyond comprehension that a Teen Titans Academy book could ever have reached levels of incompetence like this did.